Welcome, everybody. This panel is Can the Machine Be a Peace Builder's Best Friend? So we are in the Dashboards and Crisis Maps channel and portion of this conference. So the aim of this panel is really to share the results and the impact of the specific work that we've done doing online engagement to promote healing relationships and rehumanizing each other in the process in the United States through the Commons Project, and questions that have really come up that could be explored through social media monitoring. The second aim is really to present and introduce a social media monitoring dashboard that has been developed through Build Up and Data Value People, and really to support activists and civil society actors in visualizing and analyzing social media data to counter hate and polarization online. And the third is really looking at how that translates to a humanitarian context from Fadel with UNDP. And we're excited to have this conversation. We're holding this really as a conversation rather than doing more of a presentation, just as a way to humanize this topic and humanize something that is oftentimes about big data, but really sort of comes down to the details and sort of the humans behind it. So I'm going to briefly introduce myself and then turn it over to the team here. So I'm Mytty. I'm based in Boston. I'm part of the Build Up team. The particular lens that I'm bringing here is the work that we've done through the Commons Project, sort of on and off for the since 2016 in the United States, doing deep engagement on the Commons. Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm Krystel Tabet. I'm also part of the team at Build Up, and I mostly engage with anything related to digital research. And in this workshop, I'm going to be talking about the difference between traditional research and 2021's digital research development, but also how we can turn data that we see traditionally into online versions that can help us better as well, with the support of Benjamin. Benjamin?
My turn, okay. So yeah, I'm Benjamin Cerigo. I'm the founding technical architect for Data Value People. I'm predominantly a software engineer and architect that specializes in data-driven systems. And I have a passion for music and inclusion. I'll give a bit of an introduction for Data Value People as well. We're a select group of data scientists, data engineers, and software engineers that are committed to creating value for people through AI and data-driven systems. I guess I'm passing it on to Fadel.
Thank you very much. So this is Fadel from UNDP in Lebanon. So I work as the conflict analyst, but also the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan conflict sensitivity focal point. We work a lot around tensions monitoring, communal relations, and how that is translated into social stability and peace building activities as a sector, but also programmatically, not just with UNDP, but with 60 other partners. And in this workshop, specifically, we will be discussing how we're looking at social media analysis from a social stability perspective. Over to you, Kate, I guess.
Thank you. I'm excited for this just array of experiences and perspectives. So we thought that we would open it up with sort of a brief introduction to the Commons, which is work that we've been doing, and use that as a way to sort of ground how some of this work might be useful when we're asking how do each of us as individuals do engagement on social media, which many of us are on social media a lot, especially since COVID, and it plays sort of an important connecting role within our lives, and in different ways also has a lot of challenges and complications. And so I think that we hold our longer conversation around like what are sort of the tools and is social media tooling us within this space, but to really sort of ground it since 2016, what we've been doing with the Commons in the United States, really just recognizing the level of dehumanization that we've been seeing crop up both sort of historically, but also presently within the United States, and asking and knowing that social media has been a tool for this. So at different points in time in the last year, for instance, I've seen combat gear advertised through Facebook to me, advertised through YouTube to me, at very specific sort of flashpoints within everything that's going on in the United States. And so we know that there's like some level of manipulation and some level of shifting that's happening in social media. And one of the questions that we had leading up to immediately after sort of the 2016 election was, can we start to very intentionally work to build conversations around what may be sometimes sort of tricky or sometimes hairy conversations, or sometimes conversations that are overlooked within the United States. And so what we've done over the past 5 years with 3 sort of different iterations, we've done sort of direct engagement, which means a team of sort of facilitators, each commenting in different ways on our own pages, on friends' pages, or on pages, whether on Facebook or sort of Twitter, for instance, sort of local news sites, and also sort of putting out Facebook and Instagram ads into sort of targeted geographies or with targeted groups of people, really sort of aiming to open up conversation and sort of show and model a different way of engaging on social media. So what we sort of anchored here is nonviolent communication as kind of the lens for how we've been engaging in that space. This past iteration over the last year was really done through using kind of like off-the-shelf modes of social media monitoring and copying that with ACLED data. So ACLED data is the arms conflict. I'm forgetting what the LED stands for right now, but maybe somebody else remembers at the moment. Chris?
I'm Googling it, sorry.
So you're using the ACLED data, which just started in the United States. And ACLED data was important because it was highlighting very specific events. Chris is telling me that this is the armed conflict location and event data project. Thank you. I can't remember, and I forgot to write that in my notes. Data as a way to identify sort of where different types of protests or different types of potential violence had been happening within the United States, and using that then to push out Facebook ads in some situations. So for one specific instance to ground that is around the January 6th Capitol violence. Immediately thereafter, we were putting Facebook ads into some of the geographies that were known sites of violence and really just asking people more general questions, which is, what can you do now when violence can escalate? What can we do now within our communities to promote peace? And using these types of conversations to cover different themes around education, key historical events, and also around community safety. And so this is something that we've been doing through the Commons, and it led me to want to engage in sort of a broader conversation around social media and peace building and the types of tools that are being developed very specifically for peace building and humanitarian uses, and really sort of understand how might those equip us to engage with social media and sort of understand what's going on at different scales in a way that we might be able to respond directly. So I use that as a way to open this up and turn this over to Chris and just ask, what do you see as the opportunities for using social media monitoring and peace building, especially around some of the real-time events happening, and what are the types of variables that you can explore, and what are the types of variables that you may not be able to explore, but may want to be able to explore?
Perfect introduction. Thank you, Kate. Big words, peace building and digital peace building and social media monitoring, they're big concepts. But what does it come down to? Today, we're all online. Everyone is online in one way or another, whether you purchase using a credit card, whether you have a profile on Facebook, you have data that is personal to you that is now available online and accessible to some kinds of parties that for different types of data, we have different accessibility for parties. But when the humans move to the online, they also move with them their conflicts, their peace, their values, their politics. And today, the online scene is no longer a scene that we can move past and not include in what we do. Today, everything that's available online is majoritarily being used by the private sector or for-profit companies who want to use this data to sell us more, to increase our consumption, to sell us even opinions, to tell us think this, vote that, follow this, follow that. And it's been the way for the past few years, and we all know how politics has also been playing a role in buying our data and manufacturing the consent of people online. And so with data value people and also UNDP, but also at earlier stages at Build Up, we asked the question, today, we all design interventions for peace building offline. We all, as peace builders, and when I say we, I mean peace builders, we're all sitting in our houses and wondering what else can we do for this world? What can we change, and where does change happen, or where can it happen? And until very recently, all our efforts have been offline. All our efforts have been in my country, in my neighborhood, in my community, and so on. And then we do the traditional data collection to inform our project design. We do interviews, we do focus groups, we do a few surveys, we do quantitative, qualitative, and so on. But today, seeing that there's so much data that is also online and that cannot be anymore disregarded. And Kate mentioned ACLED, and we can see also with ACLED a lot of link between offline events and online events. And I know that all of the participants today, and also us as panelists, we've seen so many examples of a fight that starts online and that develops offline, of a fight that starts online and then we see the murder offline, of a targeted shaming campaign, of a targeted campaign for hate. And so we looked at so many tools that are available online to see, can these help us as peace builders? Can they give us the analysis? Can they give us the data we need? And we saw that for each tool, there was a plus and minus, because they're not tailored to us as peace builders, they tailor to the big corporates. And so we tried to fill this gap. So we sat with the data value people who are the technical partners on this project, but also obviously the think leaders of this project, the thought leaders. And we sat together and we're like, how can we quantify thousands of posts and tweets and YouTube videos, and what can we learn from them and how can we do it? And so we came up with a way that Benjamin will build on in a second. It came down to, what do we want to know when we look online? So what do we want to monitor as peace builders? What do we want to know? Our result or our answer, and we'd love to hear from you if you feel we're missing a variable or two. One, we want to know who's talking about what. Who the actor, not the name of the person, but let's say Krystel. Krystel, who is Krystel? Is she a government official? Is she a political activist? Is she a feminist? What is Krystel as a classification of Krystel? What is she talking about online? Who is listening to Krystel? Who is sharing Krystel's content and spreading it? And what are people's reactions to what Krystel is saying? Are they pro? Are they anti? Are they pushing for a specific agenda? And we can take the example of Krystel's profile and multiply it by hundreds. So it came down to, what we want to learn is who's posting what, about what are people's reactions, and is it triggering in any way offline events? So is that contributing to offline events? So we took those variables and we created different pipelines. I'm using words that are technical, so Benjamin, please correct me when I misuse them, but we used pipelines and things that are super technical to turn big quantities of words and big quantities of names of accounts into a dashboard, into something we can see, we can visualize, we can quantify, actually. We can quantify and qualify, and then we can do the analysis to inform project design. So the idea was, at the end of the research that we would be able to see, for example, in the case of UNDP, and I'm sorry, Fadel, I'm going to take one sentence from your intervention, but in the case of UNDP, for example, when they're monitoring social tensions online, one of the topics of interest in the context of Lebanon specifically is, for example, the economic collapse, the current economic collapse. So today, UNDP, through their platform and through their dashboard and the work they did to teach the system what they want to see, they can now see who's talking about economic collapse, using which sentiment. Are they pushing for a specific agenda? Are they neutral about it? Are they just reporting news? Who's buying into the narrative of hate or polarization? Who's buying into the division that's happening online? And who's sharing it and repeating this discourse? And by doing that, we can now design interventions online that can help us, instead of just doing campaigns that are in theory excellent. Today, we can base them on actual evidence that says Krystel is the one that spreads the most hate around this topic. I'm individualizing Krystel, but it's not. Imagine that it's 20 accounts or 70 accounts who are purposely talking about this topic in a negative way, and all their followers follow them only and don't follow someone else. And this is what we call the network graph, which is also one variable we look at, is who's communicating with who and who's talking to who, to see who is being the most influenced by specific agendas. So this is what I wanted to share. I don't know, Kate, if it was comprehensive enough. I just show Benjamin.
No, that was super clear. I think the one question that I had for you before we turned it to Ben, which is you spoke about sort of the example of like who's spreading hate, but I was curious, like, what are some of the queries that you've done using that process that, yeah, if you could speak to a little bit of that.
Can I ask what queries you mean? What do you mean?
Just like questions that you've done or sort of explored through the social media monitoring process.
Okay, so what happens with the social media monitoring, because it's such a large field of data, when you approach it to look at it, to research it, you need to be very specific about what you're looking at. So it really depends on your thematic area, what you're interested in looking at. So for example, one approach or one of the things we looked at is racism between two ethnic identities online in a specific geographical location, where we saw, or the person who was interested, or the party that was interested in looking at that, saw that there is something that could be built on this and that we could monitor. So then you start with a very specific question about what's happening on that digital scene. What are the conversations that are guiding the hate towards this ethnic identity and not this one, or both? And then you select all of the pages very objectively. There's also a process of selecting the pages. It's not a matter of I want to follow my friends. It's a matter of really objectively and scientifically, what are the pages that are talking about these ethnic identities and specifically about hate towards them or racism. And then you specify who you want to listen to, who you want to monitor, who, in your opinion, is influencing this conversation. And then we go through a process that we call the topic classifier, or and this Ben will be able to talk about a bit more, but we were able to develop a model that allows you to, by classifying a small percentage of posts online or tweets or YouTube channels, to recreate the same classification automatically on hundreds of thousands of posts or tweets or videos. So then you would be able to see from this pool of actors under this title or this question, who is spreading racism, from this pool of actors, who is talking about which topic and who is following these topics and how are they connecting together and what's the sentiment being raised.
That's really helpful to ground just how this might be used and really thinking about like the specificity of the questions and the types of variables that are used. Thank you, Chris. Benjamin, do you want to talk about the Phoenix and just the process and what that looks like from a technical side of it?
Yeah. So I will first, I guess, explain what Phoenix is.
Yes.
So Phoenix is a open source social media analysis platform that's specifically built for peace building. And to try to like really grasp in everybody's mind what that actually is that our goal is to try to create event-based intervention. And I guess you can kind of have like an analogy with how we use temperatures or MRI scans for medical intervention. So we're going to do a temperature and temperature, or we're going to do an MRI scan to work out what kind of medical intervention we need. Here we're going to, whatever, like Krystel was saying, come up with some network graph to work out who it is that's spreading the hate speech, or start to classify certain text to work out which posts are talking about include hate speech, and to then be able to use that evidence to then be able to have some sort of intervention online or offline even. And yeah, so that's it in the nutshell. I can obviously talk about specific details if you guys are interested in that, but please just ask me if you are, and I'm just going to stop there.
I think I was interested, and Chris spoke to some of this, but I was really curious because part of the process of creating the Phoenix was really looking at what the other structures were out there. And Chris sort of spoke about how a lot of the existing social media monitoring is built towards sort of the commercialization of data. And I was curious, like when you start to look at and spell out and sort of identify those, the specific tools or sort of functions. And Chris talked about some of these when she was introducing the research, but I was interested in what, from your perspective, was important within the development or sort of the ongoing development and emergence of the Phoenix. How does it compare?
So I think that just as repeat what you're saying, that lots of these platforms for social media analysis have been built for other people, and there lots of the technology is actually closed technology, but there is a lot of open source technology that can be used for finding analysis about text or about language, and this is called natural language processing, or we call it NLP. And these are a lot of open source kind of technologies that are built by, academics or people that are really interested in open source. And Phoenix, what it does is it takes those open source technologies and it trains them and it uses them in such a way that can find analysis for peace building. And then it also does data collection that's specific for the peace builders. So we built this in a way that we were trying to fulfill the needs of what in this case Fadel wanted, and what the UNDP wanted, and like we were saying, we started with this problem of refugees, of opinions about refugees, and that really, the most important thing there is to know, like, okay, what content is talking about refugees. So this is the first question that we have, is that how are we going to work out what kind of content we're going to analyze and we're going to find insight about, and that's then to, okay, is it about refugees or not? And the data, like selecting the data sources was the first thing that Krystel talked about. Then that selection that has to happen, and that is a human. Yeah, it needs, and at this point, it needs to be human because of the scale of the data and the knowledge that needs to go in behind that. And then, yeah, we used initially we used some simple matching words kind of thing, like, if it's got this word, then it's going to be related to refugees. If it's got refugees, then it's about refugees. And then, as we took this process further, we started to be able to make more complex sort of inference from the data we were getting, and we started to look at, for instance, whether something was talking about a certain kind of tension. I can't remember what kind of tensions they were off the top of my head, but we started to actually go through the process of building artificial intelligent models or data-driven models that could try and infer whether some content was about some topic or some tension or something. So that's kind of the couple of steps that we had in UNDP that we took.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rilla. Fadel, we're over to you. I mean, I wanted to say, right, UNDP was a critical piece of initiating this and pulling this off the ground. And so there's obviously, and your work is a lot around social media in the humanitarian space. And I was just interested to hear your perspective around what are the ways in which you are actively using, sort of thinking about using social media, and what are some of the tools that you're thinking about, and what is the type of information that you're looking for when you're really thinking about a humanitarian response, and what role social media can play. And I anchor this a lot because I think a lot of the conversations that we have through the Commons is social media enough? What is the role of social media within our society? And so I think, really sort of holding social media as part of our lives and really sort of anchoring that from your lens. Opening it up to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, just on these points specifically, it's to say that from us and our from our side of the room in terms of UNDP, how we saw things is that here we lead the Lebanon crisis response sector along with UNHCR and other partners, and specifically on social stability. Within that framework, we've been looking at tensions and monitoring tensions quantitatively and qualitatively over the past years. This does include perception surveys, an inbuilt system that is similar to what ACLED does, but it's not based on open source only, but also on close proximity data of collection of actual incidents on the ground, and a WhatsApp survey over voice notes that unpacks communities from a human-centered design. We always found that there was something missing, and that specifically was how active social media in Lebanon is. What is the difference between what we would expect on Twitter, what we would expect on Facebook, and how that would actually translate in the humanitarian programming, also development programming, because this, of course, we're the development program. But in general, looking at it from terms of programmatically, in terms of peace building, enhancing social stability, this discussion actually began for the first time in 2019. We did see through our manual monitoring how there's a connection between offline reactions and online sentiment. Sometimes it's triggered by a tweet, by a political figure's tweet, and we do see some repercussions offline. Sometimes highlighting an incident that happened in a very remote area of Lebanon on social media by an active account or influencing account does trigger offline reactions and also steers conversations. With that, we of course partnered with Build Up, and we did come up with a report that then triggered the system that we're looking at. Where we stand at the moment, to be super honest, is that the humanitarian partners and development partners in Lebanon have now reached a point where they're like, yes, without social media, we think we're missing a huge part of this loop. How can we look at it from a perspective that is not stratcoms per se, but maybe we can use a word called peacecoms? How can we identify actors? How can we try to change online sentiment? Because just the traditional way of doing things offline is not helping anymore, or at least in such a context is not, there's something in the loop that's not adding up. We do know that this is, at the moment, it's teaching us a lot about what is happening. The network analysis is actually now tangibly informing where we are in terms of the UN, at least in terms of communications in the country vis-a-vis the polarized communities. How does that change? What does that mean in terms of engagement strategies, in terms of social media strategies, but also programmatically? What we're planning to do very soon is bringing around the table the main actors in Lebanon on peace building, donors, NGOs, civil society, along with Build Up, giving them the presentation of what is the context, what is conflict sensitivity, but also how can you use online sentiment for peace building perspective? Because I mean, it's just now it's very clear. I mean, and it's very, very new. There's lots of speculations. There's lots of things that we're learning as we move. We just got the system very recently to operate by ourselves. We do see that there are keywords that are not always applicable. There's things that are highly reluctant, what do we mean by when we say that in Lebanon, social media is very, very dependent on what is happening in the offline rhetoric? How can we update that? And what does that mean for peace building? Because we can't change programs, every 2 months and say, no, this but there's a common denominator there that's like there's one thing about updating on the context, because in all the conflict analysis and the conflict assessments, we're seeing a lot that is missing. Social media does not come there. You would get 60-80 pages of a context analysis, but nothing on the online rhetoric. But we're here in a world where, I mean, just today I was sent a report by an academic institution that is citing TikTok. I mean, that's the era that we're living in, and if we just completely take it out of the picture, we're losing out on a lot.
I wanted to
just to also interrupt there as well, or to concur with what Fadel is saying, is that it's becoming more important, but also the tools are really in their infancy. So like the specific examples that I gave is just us starting out this process, and like probably we are, in comparison to some of the private closed source people that are doing this, like doing simple things, but the possibilities, maybe we could get to the point where we can do an MRI scan of a group of people, and that's really something that I'm excited about in terms of what Phoenix can do.
yeah, I'm always amazed at even looking at the cost of some of the offline and sort of existing platforms. It's so substantive and it requires a lot of technical know-how to be able to get to that point. I wanted to pull in sort of two questions and comments that are coming from everybody that is watching. And if people have questions, we are monitoring those to the chat. So feel free to keep adding them in. So Fadel, there's a question that came up for you, which is, can you tell us more about the peace comms idea and tracking online sentiment, and especially how much human effort or resource it requires versus machine effort? And this is coming from Paige Arthur.
I mean, definitely what I meant by peace comms is actually the idea that we usually look at it from a perspective where there's either this silo between humanitarian development engagement or peace building messaging that is, the traditional ways, community engagement, sometimes in-person collaborations or just extension of communications or leaflets, vis-a-vis the private sector strategic communications way of acting towards even most oftenly for peace, for profit. Basically, I think my personal opinion is that I just came up with this peace comms word. This is what I use internally with our team, but what I mean by it is actually tailoring strategic communications in general to the humanitarian development context in order to look at peace. I mean, in one specific tangible perspective is that how when we monitor tensions or specific handles online in terms of who are the most active, which are the network analysis, which are the influencers, which are the ones that are heard, or who are those people that we think might have some space within the polarized communities that we can reach to, and then start sending out messages and subliminal messages, at least to communities, or even steer a conversation in some direction or the other, rather than bringing together and sending an SMS talking about, I don't know, like the positive effect of being environmental aware over text message or SMS, which most often does not get read or doesn't actually change anything behaviorally in a behavioral perspective. So it does have this diversion between the mapping of actors, understanding the context, again, both offline and online, but then turning this into tangible steps to change behaviors or sentiment in a smart way. It doesn't have to look like you're specifically trying to change something or push for a specific sensitive agenda. But, sometimes when engaging on peace-related matters, tolerance issues, I think would be effective. And at this point, I mean, again, getting away from the buzzwords and, just not using the words that would push people away and say that this is too much of a humanitarian language that the normal people or the public wouldn't really want to engage on. And this is a lot of feedback we're getting on WhatsApp voice notes, is that we don't speak the same language. And I think that's very important for us to acknowledge, is that you guys, your social media, everything just says stuff that is not similar. And one participant once actually asked us over WhatsApp, she's like, do you use the same actors? I mean, they're just the same pictures, they're the same theme, they're the same genre, it's the same in different contexts. But these are tangible things that I think, not just reflecting at you. This is not me as UNDP, this is me as part of the humanitarian development community trying to think out loud on how we can move. And on the question, the second part, it does take a lot of human effort. It can't be machine effort at the moment. It's 2 in 1, I think. We need to know the actors. You need to have a local resource, someone that is in the community that understands it, and it just it has to keep getting updated. And then the experts like Ben and co then teach the machine how to incorporate those people or those accounts. I think it's just a two-way thing.
Hence the title of the panel. So can it be your best friend? Yes, it can, no, the machine. Ben, you wanted to say something? Sorry, I was going to.
Yeah, and I think that it's also something similar to how the relationship between a thermometer and a doctor. I know I'm using this analogy a lot, but it's my analogy, so I'm going to carry on. And that's, when you go to see the doctor, you'll say, oh yeah, my temperature is 33, but like the temperature doesn't tell you whether you've got a virus or bacterial infection. The doctor has to go and have a look at different measurements and work out what medical intervention do we need. So there's always going to be this relationship between machine and human to make sure that our interventions are producing the results that we want to have. And I think that yeah, that's what I want to say.
Yes, and I'm just going to build on this, Kate. Sorry. So just to what Fadel said and what Benjamin just added. First, Phoenix, we know that now the word is becoming a bit complicated. So, and we understand we're not sharing any visuals on this call, but if you're interested in learning more about it, please get in touch. And we're doing dry runs, we're doing video calls as well to go through the platform. And as Benjamin was saying, this process, Phoenix, which is a process that includes a system, was designed by peace builders, and therefore it included a lot of considerations that the normal traditional tools that Kate, you mentioned, are not in any way used. For example, on the ethical side of things, the data that we take is the data that is online and public. We do not use data that is in private groups. We do not use data in private accounts. If people did not specify their gender, we do not specify it for them. If people did not specify their location, we do not specify it for them. So we really take what people say is public and want to share online. So this is one way of being more peace builders in our research than corporate oriented. But also another way is we ensure that anyone who has access to this data, one does not read individuals, does not read what Krystel posted. We read in lump sum. We can dig deep into one account specifically, but generally you see the results as an entirety, as an ecosystem, as a community online, and not targeted against the person. But also we only work with peace builders. And I think that's the side that helps us preserve the ethical side the most. We only work with communities and parties and individuals and groups, and also obviously NGOs that want to use this, not to hold people accountable or to punish them or to report them to anyone, but more to see how we can introduce something new to break the cycle of violence or of polarization. To answer the question that you left me in the chat, Kate, so Dan, who's also from DVP, thanks for joining, Dan. Dan is asking if we could give examples. So I think what we could share specifically is today we're using Phoenix in 8 countries, in 8 different contexts, and in almost 12 different languages, so different dialects internally in countries. Some of the questions that Phoenix is helping us answer, for example, is, for example, in Iraq, Kurdistan, which is a question that is very interesting for me as well. In Iraq and Kurdistan, there's a group or there's a team that's currently looking at how are the conversations used and what topics are being used to increase the polarization between these two identities, the ethnic identities in Iraq specifically. And so far, for example, we're seeing, and we're not even done with the research, but so far we're seeing that conversations around budgets, the Iraqi government budget, are instrumentalized to spread hate against Kurdish people. For example, this is a very preliminary, obviously, do not quote me, but I'm just saying that we're gonna see what comes up as we move forward. But for example, this is one of the questions. In Jordan, for example, we're interested in, the team we're working with is interested in looking at how general conversations around tradition are used to censor people's opinions around specific topics, and what topics are those. In Tunisia, the team is interested in looking at how mental health, conversations around mental health is being used differently between generations. So how are older aged pages or groups or individuals talking about mental health differently than the younger generation, and what's the gap that needs to be filled to make the conversation closer and bring the community closer around mental health issues. So it's really an abundance of questions. Anything you would ask offline, you can ask online. The difference is online, you don't need to interview people, you just need to go through posts and tweets. And also with this, I'm just going to add one slight addition to what Fadel was saying about the cost and the machine being your best friend. Yes, it absolutely needs a human touch. And there's a human who's going to conduct the analysis, who absolutely needs to be subjective and from the context to understand what's happening. But at the same time, what the machine does is, if you help the machine with 10% of knowledge, the machine is going to fill the 90% based on your 10% of knowledge. So it also really cuts down the work that you do. So for example, let's take the actual dashboard that we built with UNDP. there was 2 or 3 months of building on our data, of classifying, of categorizing, of discussions internally with UNDP and the technical part and all this. But now it's fully automated. And now the automation happens every month. UNDP receives a full dashboard of what were the conversations happening this month and who was responding to what. And obviously and evidently, and this is one of the premises of Phoenix, which is also for me is very ethical, is that we say that every 3 months this data needs to be revisited. 1, because language changes. 2, because events around the world changes, and specifically in local context. And 3, because the words we use around these events change as well. So this is where there's the machine that becomes your best friend, but sometimes you hate it, so you have to work a bit more on it. But then your friendship is back on, and it only gives you data that will be helpful in designing interventions. So yeah. You sent a bunch of questions, Kate. Sorry, is it for?
There's a few questions that are coming in here for the chat. And I wanted to say that, so this is coming from Lily Baldwin, and I'm mixing in a bit of Paige Arthur's notes. So I'm just going to take these one by one, and then maybe whoever wants to jump in can jump in. So the first question is first this is super interesting, and thank you. And a few questions. Hate speech is nuanced and dynamic as it responds to changes in the context and perceptions. And Chris, you alluded this in just the changing context and sort of changing use of terms. But did you find that the terms and use and the model that you built were able to address this change and address this sort of contextual dynamic and shift as language and context shifted? And a second sort of more technical question within this, which is, were you able to monitor pictures, emoticons, and videos too, and not just text? And Paige Arthur sort of adds on here, even our colleagues at Facebook who have a truly massive resource available to them say they don't have the tools to identify hate speech. And so that feels like a helpful context piece too.
Yes. So just to answer a few, and I think Benjamin, you can you'll cover most, I think. So one thought that I forgot to mention earlier, and I'm thankful it came up in the question as well, is Phoenix is work in progress. So Phoenix, we're learning as we go. So for example, the more we have contexts we work in, now we're including dialects in specific countries in Africa or in the MENA region. We're adapting all the time. So reading images, pictures and videos, we're realizing, for example, that this is something we want to work on or might be interested in working on, and we know that there's an existing tool that can help us if we add it. I'm quoting Andrew Ben. There's an existing add-on that we can use. We're not there yet, but it's definitely something we're going towards. And currently we look at language, at text. We also look at emojis. And the text, we don't only analyze to say what the topic is about, we also analyze to see the sentiment. And this helps us with the hate speech. So just to say on hate speech specifically, first, now the world is starting to look at hate speech online. So even the existing literature is too minimal. There's a lot, but it's not as abundant as other concepts we work in offline. So it's still being defined. We're still not in agreement on an international level, and specifically in the development world, we're still not in agreement on one definition of what is hate speech and how can it be defined. And therefore, this does not give us the right framing for us to delve deeper into how to automatically do it. So far, we do it contextually. For each context we work in, the local actors or the local researchers, they know how to identify hate speech, which is also one of the values we adopt at Data Value People and Build Up. We really come with a very objective lens, and it's the local actors who guide the process, and they guide the conversation, and they guide us and say, this is how we can identify hate speech in our contexts, and so on. Ben?
Yep.
So
yeah, hate speech is nuanced and dynamic. I think this is definitely true. And I think that what I want to say is that when we're building models to try to find some sort of insight about something, we're not trying to necessarily get a complete picture. about hate speech for every single language in the world or for a specific language, we can still find insight about something with very simple models or with very you could say low tech solutions that you can still show a lot of insight. For instance, just making something we've been working recently is making an annotation tool, which means that people can look quicker through their text and label it. So that means that they're able to get through the amount of text, the amount of labeling and classification quicker than if they were to do it, by copying through a spreadsheet or something like that. So those kind of simple tools means that we're able to get more information from the data that we have. And in terms of then, able to monitor pictures, emoticons, videos too. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of large companies that are trying to do that. For instance, YouTube has a captions endpoint, which means you can find out what you could call subtitles of the video, and you can then analyze that if you want. So these large companies are putting a lot of effort into these kind of, I guess, utilities to be able to analyze different kinds of medium. Of course, in the system we built, we didn't get to that point. And in terms of like the response on Facebook, so I would take it with a pinch of salt when they say they don't have the tools to identify hate speech. I think they mean they aren't able to 100% identify hate speech all of the time. It's just my opinion, in the sense of it's probably not possible to do that, to find an AI system that actually can do that, because we're going to need a huge amount of information. However, having some sort of automation that means that we can find out 80% of the hate speech because it has the word killing, something like that's already, we're already making huge amounts of progress. And I'm 100% sure that Facebook has a pipeline in which they have a sort of automated process, and that clears out a huge amount of the data that they're trying to process. And then they have like this small amount of 20% of data that they don't know what to do with, which is more nuanced. And at that point, there needs to be some human intervention. So I think saying that AI or data-driven systems or models are going to solve the 100% of the problems is actually not really looking at how automation helps us already doing simple tasks, and also that we don't want AI to understand hate speech. Like, who cares about that? Like, the AI doesn't need to do that. We want to find insight that's be able to give us evidence-based intervention in the end.
Yes.
Fadel, you just came off of mute.
Oh no, I was unmuted the whole time.
Okay, cool.
Just noticed
So
that.
I feel like I'm sure that you have a lot to respond to that. And I also wanted to add in sort of 3 other components that maybe you could touch on in sort of responding to that, which is, one, do you have sort of examples of how you were able to use some of the data in the social media monitoring for targeted interventions? In that space, sort of what does impact actually mean? And how do we also use this to connect engagements or interventions online with sort of the offline context?
I mean, just on that point specifically, I think the way, I mean, here it's not me, of course, claiming that what we're doing thus far is the best practice or not, but it's just sharing of experiences. But how we did it since 2019 is we actually gathered the evidence around it with the existing platform that we have through the tensions monitoring system as UNDP in Lebanon. We do have access to field level staff, the programmatic, more senior individuals within the community, but also the donors and the political actors within the UN, as well as the donor community in Lebanon. With this, how we actually tangibly used it is within just the past 2 months, within the available frameworks, I actually incorporated our conflict analysis in addition to the social media landscape and the tensions that are arising, the sentiment that we see, and how this is connected primarily to the overall landscape in the country. with tangible propositions, one of which was to encourage donors to include in their peace building projects and portfolios, a social media campaign or a component which is actually beyond or out of the box in terms of not just engaging on their official channels, but actually going beyond that and reaching to more localized groups and platforms rather than just, you know, the lower hanging fruits or the same, I would call them the recycled influencers within the community that are used by each and every NGO or UN agency again and again and again. And with the context becoming more and more acute, I think it's time to change. And what actually and tangibly we did through the social stability sector, which is an official framework that governs the partners and ourselves in the coming year for 2022, within the crisis response plan, we included it as a distinct objective with distinct activities, one of which would be this partnership with Build Up early next year to start with kickstarting a session or a training for partners on the field, and then moving forward with programmatic implications, even with piloting, and we're even willing to pilot something, just to give an example, moving forward. So these are tangible ways, and I think it's always key and important for us to merge between two things. One is the programmatic crowd, which are there to use it and make use of it. But as important is actually the policy people or the policy audience. Those are the people that are injecting the money, setting the priorities, but also communicating with their headquarters. And that this language is not technological, but very development oriented, but this is how it operates. There are donors, there are systems that we need to mobilize, and this is how I think you get to that objective for easier. But one last thing about how we connect online and offline. I mean, one tangible example from October is when through the online sentiment and the social media analysis dashboard that we have, when we downloaded it and put it together with our offline incident monitoring, we did see the spike in sentiment right after key events occurred during that month, day by day. We did see when we had in October 13 clashes in Beirut between two political factions, and that was a mini civil war, as many had seen. We did see that the sentiment and the traffic online did actually almost quadruple just within that 24 hours. And the days after it, we could see that this is how much it's connected, and this is how much it impacted the topics and the engagements thereafter. And then also we had a diplomatic dissension with the Gulf states, between Lebanon and the Gulf states. And again, we saw that there was no offline reactions, but the online reactions and the online pressures did actually result in a number of individualized sit-ins and protests. So just to echo it is that, yes, these are tangible ways of how these are, it's either driven here or there, but they are connected and the evidence is showing this. But most importantly is adding that local touch in terms of you have to analyze it and put the dots together, and that cannot be done by. So though the machine is a best friend, but the BFF is actually the local resource or the researcher that knows the context also, because without that, it's just numbers and it's abstract. Because sometimes, just one small example is, if you could see there's 100, you could see a large amount of traffic that is sarcasm. If you look at the emoticons on Facebook that are laughing or whoa or others, but these are, they might be sarcastically referring to something negative. And that in itself needs, you know, someone, a human, and see what that may mean or not according to the topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that human piece of it is so critical. I wanted to build off of what you were saying, Fadel, and just say briefly that one of the things that we've done through the Commons is both use advertisements to do specific targeting to open up conversations. So I mentioned what we did sort of after January 6th, but what we had also done was we took a few subjects that have been coming up in the United States. So for instance, policing has been coming up quite a lot in the United States. And so one of the things that we did was we put out just questions and use them sort of as a response mechanism. So sort of asking people, what can they do? In essence, like what creates safety within a neighborhood? and within your community was one thing that we had done. Another piece that we had done was the Tulsa race massacre is not something that the vast majority of people within the United States learn about. And there's a lot of these histories within the United States that we just don't learn about and are like intentionally sort of quashed and sort of put down in sort of history. And so recognizing that the 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre came up earlier this year, was we used that as a moment to also open up conversations around whether people were aware of this event and where did they learn about that event and what did that mean for them to really sort of understand that event and be within the United States. And I say this because I think the human side of it's really critical, because it was like me and 3 other people that were doing the like deep response. And so it's a very human response to be able to say, how do I build a space for sort of honest exchange and honest feedback and sort of honest relationships within spaces that can sometimes feel very big, like social media, unless you're sort of speaking sort of one-on-one. And so we did that both within our personal networks, but also sort of more large networks through sort of Facebook advertising in a very targeted way. So anyway, happy to chat about that. We also have a lot of documentation online. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I wanted to, one, give everybody a chance to close with maybe 1 minute of a closing thought. And 2, there's a specific question from Ali Spring, which is wondering about future feedback loops stemming from Phoenix. Are there plans to communicate findings about youth with certain groups like educators or parents? And if so, could you share more on that? And so maybe Chris or Ben could answer that.
I can start with the first part, Ben, and if you want, you can build on it. Just on the impact level, because also there was a question on impact, which I think also pours into that last question. And my last 1 minute statement. So I'm going to combine them all into 1 minute and just say, on the level of impact, personally, as Krystel, I think, just like we do it traditionally, I think impact is so much easier to measure online than offline. Offline, for example, you could do pre-post assessment surveys, you can do M&Es, you can do interviews to assess the impact and so on, which are very, very good tools as well. But on the online, you just measure the conversation 6 months later after you do your intervention. You just check in again, take the same group of people you're looking at, ask the same question and see if there's in any way any change in how the conversations are happening. And I think impact there is very numeric. We can see it, we can see it on the screen. It's there. There's no argument about it, which is why I really like social media monitoring. And on the second question, is there an intention to share? I think the results we don't share. One, because they're not ours. It's really the local partners who own the results of the research. And the intention is to create a change and not to, and it's like the intention is to inform their designs and to give them ideas on how they can create a change online, and less about publishing info that says, oh, look, these are the pages that are saying this and these are the pages that are saying that. So I think it also falls under the ethical part of how we're doing the work we're doing. But even with UNDP, obviously we're not going to tell Fadel, do not share your data, but it's his data. If they share it, they share it. But as build up and data value people, we do not share what we see on the dashboards that we work on with our partners. Is that it? I forget something.
I know.
Last at the end, go for it.
Yeah, no, Ben, go for it. Close us out.
Close us out. Okay. Yeah, I guess that thinking about automation in a lean way, meaning like what's the minimum amount of effort we could get to maximize our interventions and make them evidence-based, is really how we should be working with machines, and not thinking that they're the complete solution for everything. And how, yeah, that's it.
Fadel, I think there's 30 seconds for you.
I mean, just to say that's exactly the summary of everything. It's just, there is something wrong in the Peacebuilder's way of doing work at the moment. There was a missing component, and this is the online space basically, and I think moving forward this is how we can result not just in more peace building initiative, but something that is much more conflict sensitive and accounts for the context. And I think by the time we start translating that analysis in our conflict analysis and our programs, that's when at least we're starting to kickstart. And we're happy as UNDP to engage with other colleagues like Lily and others in terms of sharing practices, but also sharing notes. And yes, we just basically they can reach out and our email could be shared, whichever channel could be helpful.
Even using Phoenix.
What's that?
Even using Phoenix, if they do something similar, it's open source.
Absolutely. Yeah, Phoenix is open source. You can find that on howtobuildup.org or datavaluepeople.com.
Just get in touch. It's where our emails are in the biography, and yeah, as Benjamin said, we'd love to go through a dry run with you and show you what can be done.
Beautiful. Thank you all for joining. We really appreciate all your questions, and take good care.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Fadel. Thanks, Ben. It was great.